Hello, welcome to another Always Reforming podcast with Bobby Grow. It's been a while, but I wanted to do another podcast here on the topic of classical theism today. And I kind of just want to clear the air a little bit on where I'm at these days. I've been developing myself, which is interesting to me, but that's what we're going to get into today. Is classical theism and how in fact do I understand classical theism? What do I think it entails? And I want to talk about the kind of modified form of classical theism that I follow, that I attempt to articulate mostly through my blog and through the edited books that Mike Habitz and myself have done. But, so just take this for what it's worth, as usual. I'm just really a nobody out here in the big world of theology. And so, but I always like to give my thoughts, of course, just like everybody else in our social media age. And so, hopefully you find this somewhat insightful. But yeah, I just want to talk about classical theism. I've been an outspoken opponent of classical theism for many years, pretty much my whole time blogging. But I've come to realize that I am a classical theist. And I don't say that lightly, but that's where I'm at. Was trained in my Bible college and seminary experiences in classical theism, just your basic Reformed thinking in regard to who God is, theology proper and doctrine of God, and all the attending corollary doctrines that follow that most primary one in regard to who God is, theology proper. And I didn't realize back then, even in seminary. Well, I started to realize it in seminary, but in Bible college, I didn't realize that that's what was going on. I didn't even realize there was such a thing called classical theism. I just like every other evangelical in the world, just believed that there was God, and the God of the Bible. I didn't realize all the various developments that had taken place in the history of theological development in the Christian church. And so that's something I did realize in seminary as I began to study historical theology. And I was introduced to this idea of classical theism at that time, primarily through the works of, at that point, this is way back in 2002, Colin Gunton, who was the supervisor and mentor of my mentor. Well, he wasn't a doctoral supervisor for my mentor, but he was doctoral supervisor for one of my other professors at seminary, Paul Metzger, at King's College, University of London. But then he was also a mentor of my mentor, who also got his PhD at King's College, University of London, Ron Frost. And so, as a result of Gunton's influence upon them, that trickled down to being an influence upon me. And so, as a result of their connection as well with Gunton, he came and actually gave what was called a Staley Scholarly Lectureship back in, I think it was 2002, in my first semester at Multnomah Biblical Seminary in Portland, Oregon. And so I got to talk to him just briefly. Got to meet Gunton in person at that time. But anyways, I'm just bringing that up because this is my introduction to classical theism, to the realization that there is this thing called classical theism that so many Christians just take for granted. They don't even realize, evangelical Christians don't even realize that there's this classical heritage in regard to a doctrine of God, who God is. And so, but my introduction, as I'm saying, came through Gunton primarily, and then historical theology that I was learning under the teaching and mentorship of Ron Frost. And that was primarily focused, well, in the realms of patristic and Reformation, medieval, and then Puritan theologies. And that's where my introduction came. And my introduction to classical theism was primarily a negative one. And so, again, this is back in 2002, 2003, when I was doing Master of Arts. And now my Master of Arts would be called, they've demarcated their master's degrees. This is an aside. So my Master of Arts now, if I did exactly what I did back then, would be a Master of Arts in New Testament Studies. And I had another emphasis in historical theology. But back then it was just generically called a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies. So as I worked on my Master of Arts in Biblical Studies, that was the most academic degree that you could get at Multnomah Biblical Seminary at that point. And it still is one of their academic degrees. Now they've designated that as MA New Testament, MA Old Testament, MA Theology. So, but those are for marketing reasons. So yeah, if I go back now, my Master of Arts degree is MA in New Testament Studies, with another emphasis in historical theology. And so it was at that time, as I was doing that degree, that classical theism came onto my radar. And as I was saying, it was a largely negative notion of what classical theism, and a pretty nuanced or idiosyncratic introduction, really, as I look back, to what classical theism is. Because in fact, what I was told, and I'm even reading a book I Colin Gunton right now, his Triune Creator. So it's an older book, that's 98 publication. What I was told back then, the impression I was given of classical theism, was that it was really just had to do with Thomas Aquinas. And that's true. I mean, that's not untrue. Thomas Aquinas gave the Christian West, the Christian church in the West, a version of classical theism modulated through his synthesis of Aristotelianism, his appropriation of Aristotle's categories, and synthesis of those with a doctrine of God, and then that, of course, bleeds down to the rest of his theology, soteriology, etc. So that was my introduction, was that classical theism was synonymous with the Aristotelian synthesis that Thomas Aquinas gave his theology, and bequeathed to the Western Church in general. Not that his theology in his lifetime was, and just after his lifetime, was something that was celebrated necessarily by the Roman Catholic Church or the Catholic Church, but it has since become the dominant teaching or understanding of doctrinal development among Catholic theologians. And so this is what I came to think of as classical theism, that it was purely an Aristotelian phenomenon as far as the categories for the development of Christian theology, and that this then was taken over by not Calvin, not Luther so much, even though they ended up still appealing to at points, especially Calvin, the Thomist or Aristotelian theory of causation, and their own reception of that. So I'm not saying it's a one-for-one appropriation of Thomas Aquinas, but I'm saying that they're in the period, just because that's what was available. To say someone like John Calvin, you end up with these categories of determination and causation, a primary and secondary causation, and the causes that we get from Aristotle and in modulated form through Aquinas. And so, again, this is how I came to understand classical theism. And I think, insofar as that went, that was correct. That there's an emphasis upon God's divine simplicity, His immutability, His impassibility, His infinity, His eternality. All of these categories associated with classical theism, the omnis. God is omniscient. He's omnipotent. And so on and so forth. These categories are characteristic and component parts of what classical theism is characterized by. And so, and then those parts are what make up our conception of classical theism. And so why is it called classical, though? How could we say that it's classical? And if we absolutize that term vis-a-vis Thomas Aquinas' development, that doesn't seem completely accurate. That seems too focused, too idiosyncratic. Isn't there a more universal Catholic, small c, understanding of what classical reaches back into? And yes, that's the case. So, a lot of people these days, theologians, are arguing, especially in Reformed camp, are like Mike Allen, Scott Swain, Peter Leithart, however you say his last name. They're arguing for a Reformed Catholicity, right? And so the appeal goes that there's this golden thread of theism, of Christian theistic understanding that starts very early on in patristic theology, even with Athanasius, Augustine, of course, especially Augustine or Augustine, and it threads its way through the history up until the present, that we can follow this kind of golden thread of classical, now we call theism. That all of these categories I just mentioned weren't distinct to Thomas Aquinas and his appropriation of Aristotelian categories, but that these we can see simplicity, God's simplicity, that He is non-composite, that He is not made up of parts, that He is singular in His being. That these are component realities present in, like I just mentioned, Athanasius, Augustine, Maximus Confessor, and Boethius, and just working your way through Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, Calvin, Luther, Bullinger, Ursinus, Beza. Working your way all the way from the early on period of the church, the patristic period, into the early, medieval, Middle Ages, medieval theology, into the magisterial reformers, in and through then the post-reformed Orthodox, post-reformed Reformation theology, into the Puritan period, and then we lose it about the 18th century, where we veer off. Post-Enlightenment, in Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment theology begins to taper off into an Enlightenment understanding of God, based upon where the elevation of man's reason becomes a standard of understanding who God is versus a revelational basis for that. So the story goes. And so classical theism develops through a period of centuries, of course, from the very early church and up to the start of the modern period, where the thesis is, and you can read about this in someone like Richard Muller, but plenty of others. The thesis is that around the 18th century, post-Enlightenment theology, rationalism, Christian Wolffian theology began to really penetrate the development even of Reformed theology until we get into, thinkers like, we have Spinoza, but he's like René Descartes, but these are earlier. These are antecedents, people might say, to the development of an enlightened world where reason gains transcendency over revelation. And so then we finally get to people like William Hermann, but even before that, Friedrich Schleiermacher, of course, is the most famous fountainhead for the development of what is called modern theological liberalism. Some people say that's wrong. They say that Schleiermacher gave us liberalism, but if you look at his theology, I don't think that's wrong at all. I think that's a fair characterization of what Schleiermacher gave the world. Now, people push back on me on that as well. Schleiermacher folks who want to argue that Schleiermacher actually gave us a very Christological focus in regard to God. And yes, he did. And interestingly about Schleiermacher is that he actually is somebody who began to turn the tide, so to speak, ironically, against what was happening contra folks like, John Locke. Just the emphases where reason, again, has gained this ascendancy. We have Schleiermacher pushing back on that, and with his aesthetic theology, and trying to work around all of those romantic, rationalist categories, and basing his theological methodology, his prolegomena, and human dependence or feeling, and basing theology upon this kind of universal sense of feeling, of dependency upon the concept of God, and constructing a classical theism from a kind of soteriological vantage point that way, focusing on the person. And then we get this, it develops further, and from Schleiermacher, in Hermann, in I'm trying to think of other names, Ritschl, in people like these, until we finally get to, we get the revolution in biblical studies, where Gabler signals the distinction between biblical studies, and this is all happening all around the same time as the 18th century, around the time of Schleiermacher, where we get this distinction between biblical studies and theology, and unfortunately, and biblical studies goes off on its own merry way into a deconfessionalized approach to doing biblical studies. It's no longer relying upon a classical theism. It's no longer doing its studies based upon a confessional mode, but instead a text critical, historical critical, so-called mode that developed precisely out of the Enlightenment period, where reason, again, had gained the ascendancy over revelation. And then we finally get to, we have people like Albert Schweitzer, I just wrote about, and others in his Jesus quest, though. And so we have these criteria in place where God now is subject to the history of religions, and form criticism, redaction criticism, and just these text critical approaches that believe that they can naturalistically reconstruct the history of the Bible, and based upon the criteria that they use to do that, we won't get into that right now, because I'm really even rabbit trailing right now, but I'm going to bring it back to classical theism. But based upon those naturalistic criteria, they end up giving us a picture of God in Jesus Christ that is completely abstract and detached from any conception of a classical notion of God, and one that is based now in human experience, existentialism, and we finally get to someone like Rudolf Bultmann, who really presses this existentialist approach to not just New Testament studies, but theology in general. And so he is a New Testament. His field was New Testament studies, but he really was a dogmatic theologian in his own right, so to speak. Dogmatic, let's call him a systematic theologian. He's not really dogmatic, because dogmatics are theology done for the church. He wasn't really a theologian for the church. He was a theologian for the academy in a very specialized way in the realm of so-called New Testament studies at that point in his period. But, so yeah, we have all of these things happening and all of these influences. And so you have Bultmann and Karl Barth. They're contemporaries of one another. And they went their own separate ways, really. Contra David Congdon's thesis that they were closer together than they actually were. I don't believe that, based upon my own studies in Karl Barth over these many years, these last at least 15 years that I've really been involved with Barth studies. But Karl Barth is the one who really... So we have... I brought up Schleiermacher and how he kind of started turning the tide. And he kind of did. He had an Augustinian approach, more of a soteriological emphasis. So he started to turn... Even though the way he did it was methodologically is problematic. And I think he ends up giving us someone like a Bultmann, where the focus is on existentialism and the knower, the knowing agent, and who precedes knowledge of God, who constructs God out of projection of experience and self-knowledge that way. We do have those bases in Schleiermacher, but he's a mixed bag. In Schleiermacher, we have someone who starts to point people back to the possibility of a knowledge of God that dovetails or coheres with a more classical conception of God. Well, so let's look at that influence as kind of a case study in Bultmann and Barth. Barth picked up on that kind of classical turn, returning back to Reformed theology and the strange new world of the Bible as he began to read the Bible for himself, and which resulted in his commentary, his Der Romer brief, his commentary on Romans. Okay, so we have Barth going one way, and as theologians of his time, as they read his commentary on Romans, they called it was like a bomb on the playground of the theologians. It kind of exploded the categories because of the influence of the theological liberalism that had bled down, starting with Schleiermacher, but through other figures like Ritschl and Hermann and others. And so we have Barth, he really begins to draw even that realm, that German theology, back to its a Reformed heritage, as Barth begins to not just read the Bible, not just do his commentary on Romans, which got him into the academy at that point, out of his pastorate of Saffenwall, Switzerland, but got him into the academy. He became the Reformed professor at Göttingen, and this is where he really begins to engage with the Reformed scholastics, with Calvin, with Luther, and he gives himself essentially a crash course, and that crash course is a germination of his own theological development from that point on, which finally results in his 6 million word church dogmatics over the next many, many years. And before, prior to that, he wrote his Goddington dogmatics. And there's all these turns and shifts in his theological development from a more theocentric to a Christocentric turned from as he turned towards a doctrine of election, which really began to shape in CD22 his theological project as a whole in ways that are I find very fruitful still. But anyways, so we have Barth really pushing people back to, in that realm, in the liberal theological realm, to a classical theistic understanding of God, if we can say it like that. Now, that's very highly contested by folks like Bruce McCormick and others who follow after his theses in his critically realistic dialectical theology, that basically his PhD dissertation that was published years ago now. But his thesis there, as far as the way that Barth developed and how McCormick takes that even further though, as he reads, it kind of reads Barth more into, I would say, a modern mold and personage as a theological thinker, and really makes Barth a post-metaphysical theologian. Now, of course, there's the so-called Barth wars that have gone on between McCormick and Hunsinger and Molnar and others. And now I prefer Molnar and Hunsiker's reading of Barth. Hunsiker calls Barth, George Hunsiker out of Princeton calls Barth, his reading the textual versus the revisionist McCormickian reading of Barth. You know, it's still an ongoing thing, at least in Anglophone Barth studies. But I prefer the textual understanding of Barth, because the textual understanding of Barth is a classical theistic understanding and appropriation of Karl Barth's theology, and versus a more modern, emphasized, post-metaphysical, post-liberal, maybe, although that kind of gets into the Yale school, but to use that language, but post-metaphysical understanding of God in Karl Barth's theology, which is what is the way that McCormick, and now David Congdon, a student of McCormick, who did his research on Rudolf Bultmann. Now, Rudolf Bultmann, now that I mentioned him, Rudolf Bultmann, while Barth goes with the turn more to the classical that Schleiermacher helped to start shifting back towards, Bultmann picks up and stays with the existentialist aspect, if we could say that about Schleiermacher's theology, in theological development, where knowledge of God, knowledge of Christ is based upon encounter, and my decision to know God in the kerygma, in the gospel, charismatic event of me knowing or experiencing God by faith in Christ. I come to an experience of God that way. So there's an abstraction of a historical reality of God's revelation, actually a negation of that in Bultmann's theology, and an ungrounding of that in contingent historical reality. And knowledge of God is now strictly based upon my existential encounter with the risen, so-called Christ. And that's where it stays. There's no objective grounding in historical contingency. There's no antecedent ontological reality to who God is for the existentialist theologian. It's all constantly, always, already, afresh and anew, based upon encounter with God in my experience of God in the faith event of the kerygma that is presented therein. And so there's an ultimate severing of God's revelation in history from... So there's a severing that happens between that and then into a knowledge of God that is strictly based upon my personal encounter with this so-called God, and knowledge of God, who God is, based upon this ever-changing, ever-shifting knowledge base that is grounded in not just my psyche, but the collective psyche of so-called Christians. So we can see where that might lead and how deleterious that is, destructive that can be for a development of a knowledge of God. Okay, so now I've given this long sketch, this kind of survey of this quick survey of how knowledge of God, classical theism, within that framework, has developed. How it went from a knowledge of God based upon particular kinds of philosophical categories that have ostensibly been evangelized by the gospel, the pressures of the gospel, finally leading us into tailing off into an existentialist understanding of God, that it no longer believes that we need to have a metaphysics, in other words, a kind of logical construct that conceives of God as an antecedent reality, as an ontological reality, who penetrates time, space, history in the revelation of Jesus Christ and reveals himself to us and allows that revelation to, like I just said, evangelize this metaphysical understanding of God, and whereby we use the categories that are embedded within the fabric of even creation itself, this operating off of this presupposition that we can know God based upon categories that are, I guess, I don't like saying the word latent, but I will, latent, that are built into the very fabric, the very structures of creation itself, that we can gain these categorical insights into what godness entails by reflecting upon these contingent, these communicable ideas about who God is, that He Himself, as the story would go, has revealed about Himself even in the creation itself, and thereby we can come up with philosophical categories like simplicity, like impassibility, like immutability, by the via negativa, the negative approach of reflecting upon who God must be based upon our experience. Again, there is a notion, there is a also early on, even the development of classical theism, of basis of knowledge of God in experience. So that's ironic, even as I talk this out, that there is an experiential node of knowledge of God, even in the classical theistic framework for knowledge of God, because philosophical categories are based upon humanity's experience, or pushing up against God as they discover Him through rigorous reflection upon what would be required for creation itself to take place. So we have this kind of, interestingly, this kind of posit of universal categories based upon who God is in nature and creation, versus a collapse or immanentization of that into individual experience based upon a kind of encounter with God based supposedly off of the charismatic bases provided for in Christ, but ultimately then the collapses into the knowing agent, myself, and my the way that I want to construe that. And so there's this idea. So really, we're getting to issues of theory of revelation. I'm really going off here on tangents, but primarily we have competing theories of revelation. And so let me get back. Okay, I've talked all about this development of doctrine of God, classical theism, existentialist theism, as we might want to call it, um, and in between those things, those poles. My influences now, of course, have been Thomas Torrance, Karl Barth, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Athanasius, Augustine. I mean, I have the gamut, just like most evangelical thinkers, Christian thinkers, informing the way that I conceive of God. I've been tempted to become post-metaphysical. If you can't, that's kind of a misnomer. But to use that language, we know what we're talking about. If we're aware of these things, post-metaphysical is kind of the liberal. Some like to say neo-orthodox. I don't like that word; is completely unhelpful. It doesn't help at all, I don't think. But during a period of time, Barth was considered neo-orthodox. Torrance, Emil Brunner, and others are cast as neo-orthodox. I don't really think that's helpful at this point. But so we have this kind of mediating, that's what it's called, mediating theology. And that's what a lot of the liberal so-called theology, Schleiermacher et al., their theology are known as mediating theology because they're mediating supposedly between the pre-modern classical theism and modern theological liberalism and the conception of God therein. Okay, so these are my influences. They're things I've been struggling with over the years. I've gone back and forth between post-metaphysical versus metaphysical conceptions of God, and I got bit, to be honest. I've been reading David Congdon's book, big book on Rudolf Bultmann, and there's a lot of things in there because there are, as Paul Hinlicky has noted, there's at least 3 levels in Congdon's book, and one of those books, and this is the reason I was really reading his book. It wasn't really to understand Rudolf Bultmann's theology. It was better. It was really, for me, the level I was reading Congdon's book at was to have a better understanding of modern theology and its development. And I still think that there's much value in his book in that regard. And so I'm going to finish it because of that. I'm at page 500. There's like 900 pages. So I'm a little over halfway through his book. But as I read his book, because of these inklings that I've had towards post-metaphysical reading of Barth and an analogia fide versus an analogia entis, an analogy of Barth's analogy of faith versus something like Aquinas's or Eric, I can't even say his last name, Paris was, analogy of being. I'm definitely committed to Barth's analogy of faith. Okay, so again, this gets us back into theory of revelation. These are interrelated realities, as all things are in dogmatics and systematic theology. And so because of my predisposition that way, there's things in, and as Congdon is surveying, as much as he's developing and engaging with Bultmann's theology, he's surveying also the history of modern theology. So I'm prone to that. I can identify that in myself. I am prone to modern theology. I like things about modern theology. But as I've been reading Congdon's book at one level, I found myself getting kind of seduced into the way he's describing Bultmann and even Barth. And because it fits with kind of my predisposition towards theory of revelation, analogy of faith, that knowledge of God is based upon through faith, as Calvin, a theme for him is that faith is knowledge of God. Okay, so, but that's of course amplified, reified, and modified in modern theology in different ways than Calvin intended, of course, as well, because of the categories he had available to him. But anyway, so my idea of classical theism is this. Here's where I want to really get to with this podcast after everything that I've said. My idea of classical theism, my modification of classical theism, is what we get in someone like Thomas Torrance. And I see Thomas Torrance as someone who's a mediating figure between someone like Barth. Now, my reading of Barth fits very well with Torrance's reading of Barth. Okay, and that's Muller and Hunsaker. So that's the way I like to go with Barth. But anyways, I'm not totally sure that it's not the most. It's not the. I think there's parts about Barth that fit better with the way McCormick reads him as a more modern post-metaphysical theologian. The way Congdon tries to read him into Bultmann, and vice versa. But anyway, this is my modified approach to classical theism. I believe that there's an antecedent reality to who God is. I believe that God's ontological life comes prior to his immanent life in the economy, that ad extra in his self-revelation to us. But I do believe that we can't abstractly conceive of these categories of God, but that they must be based in his self-revelation. So this is where the modified part of my classical theism. So you have people like Barth or the McCormick understanding of Barth and the Bultmann even more explicitly, and others in the post-metaphysical camp who believe that that there is not this prior idea of God. They believe you need to erase any conception of God's like simplicity, these kinds of concepts that they believe are completely philosophically based. Which, hey, I don't disagree with them, and I in that sense. But I think, they go so far that they want to completely, and I think this is Congdon's problem. They want to completely erase any remainder conception of God, that we can conceive of God in any way apart from his self-revelation. Now, in principle, okay, I agree with that. And so do many classical theists. In principle. Of course, how that gets fleshed out is variant among thinkers. But the way post-metaphysical existentialist theologians like Congdon et al. Approach that is that they want to completely get away from any kind of two-stage, two-structured, dual notion of revelation, a two books notion of revelation of theology, in nature and then special revelation in the Bible or in Jesus. And so they want to completely ground it in Christ and completely erase in a manic almost kind of way the idea that, hey, there could be some prior notion of God that we can talk about alongside of Augustine, Athanasius, patristic theology, medieval theology, reformational theology, post-reformational theology. That's where I'm comfortable with that, but I'm going to approach it through the prolegomena of the analogy of faith, Barth's analogy of faith. So people are still gonna, if you listen to this, you're gonna think, okay, well, you're still just a Barthian, Bobby. Well, maybe at a certain level, yes, I probably always will be. But I want to signal to this idea that I find value in classical theism. That I do believe that metaphysics play a part in our knowledge of God. The way that I evangelize those metaphysics, though, will be from Thomas Torrance's, Karl Barth's side, and they do have a modern twist to their engagement with, their appropriation of classical theism. But I repudiate so-called post-metaphysical theologies like Rudolf Bultmann's. And so I don't even know if this has clarified anything for anybody, if you're going to listen to this, if you're listening to this. But it's been a helpful exercise for me. I've lost all of my time. I've run out of my time. I'm down to 40 seconds right now out of my 45 minutes available. So I appreciate you listening to this. I don't know if I've clarified anything for you. And I'm not sure I've said exactly what I wanted to say as far as classical theism. I might have to do another one just to try to clarify where I'm at on that. But blessings to you. I hope you have a great day today. God bless you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.